Hey guys, before we start the show, I just want to give a quick shout out to another podcast. Hey, don't forget to check out the Pacific War podcast week by week in association with Kings and Generals. Hello there, welcome back to the Pacific War channel, where we cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War of 1937 to 1945 and all the major events that led up to it. I am here yet again with my dutiful co-host.
What's up, everybody? Nice to be back.
Formerly known as Mr. Economics.
I have officially lost that title. Now I'm just the guy who's trying to learn a little more about history.
And we are doing a episode talking about a YouTube episode I put out, which was a bonus episode for my World War I series. This time it was Southeast Asia during World War I. I think a little bit of a surprise to some people that I made this one, but a very vocal crowd of mostly Vietnamese had asked for something that was, close to content based on Vietnam. I think they were looking more for the Franco-Vietnam War, but, I was already doing World War I, so this kind of worked out. So that's why we're here today. Before we jump right into it, I am going to just talk a little bit about the direction of the podcast, because by the time this episode comes out, another episode will have piloted, and that's kind of branching into this new territory for the podcast. So as many of you listeners, I guess, would already be aware, I'm beginning to do kind of standalone discussions on anything about the Pacific War. The first episode was a kind of hypothetical alternate history episode about what if Japan attacked the Soviet Union during World War II.
Shut the fuck up. Know your fucking place, trash.
What if Hoku Shinran happened? And that was with my friend Eric. There's a few other episodes that have already been filmed at this point with other guys with other hypothetical questions, but there'll be episodes where we'll just talk about, it could be any subject, like what's the difference in food on the islands during the Pacific War? What would have happened if a certain battle went another way, things like that. So I hope the audience likes this, and that will be an ongoing thing with the podcast going forward. But the thing that me and Justin have been doing this whole time, where we talk about my YouTube episodes, will still always be present. Rest assured. Justin still has a job.
Yay.
So for those who aren't used to these kind of discussion podcasts, basically we ask there's about three phases of the podcast. First, I ask my guests, what do they think of the episode? What surprised them? What did they learn? Stuff like that. Second part is kind of like what didn't make it into the episode, because I write 10 pages or something for most of these episodes, and I have to cut it down in half usually. The third part will be me answering audience questions I found in the YouTube episode or on Reddit and other places. And this episode happened to have quite a lot of questions, so there'll be a lot of that in this one. So, I'll just start it off with, what did you think, Justin?
Well, you know what? Southeast Asia during World War I is something that's not talked about a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, already, me not coming from a historical background, my education in this is not the best, but when it comes to that whole region, whether you're talking about Singapore, whether you're talking about Taiwan, Philippines, it doesn't really matter. You don't hear about it. So knowing what their involvement was, where their allegiances lied, what the reasons for that, it's nice to talk about it a little bit to really figure out what was going on in that area of the world at the time. As far as the episode goes, I mean, very straightforward, was pretty easy to follow. Although you guys in the comments can help me out, I actually want to start a poll in the comments to which is worse, Craig's Asian pronunciations or Craig's French pronunciations.
You don't frighten us, English pig dogs. Go and boil your bottoms.
Yeah, I knew this was coming up.
For those of you who don't know, we come from the French part of Canada.
Ah ouais, Kevin, si continue comme ça, c'est même connu.
And while we're both predominantly native English speakers, we've lived here our whole lives, and Craig is married to a French woman. So I don't think there's any excuse for this. I would love if you would all make fun of him in the comments with me and help me out with that a little bit, because good God, was it painful to watch. But we did learn some stuff. So let's get into it a little bit. So let's get into it a little bit. Where did we start it off in the episode? Was Vietnam, wasn't it?
Yeah, I started with the Vietnamese, followed by the Cambodians, and then the Thai.
Yeah. Now, the Vietnamese, we had kind of mentioned them in passing in previous episodes. You mentioned in this episode that the first naval deaths were when they got into a little skirmish with the, not US, I always want to say USS Emden, but
SMS Emden.
SMS Emden, thank you. Which we talked about in the German Raiders episode.
Yeah.
You know, that was, mind you, you're talking about less than 10 deaths, I think. But
that were officially the first casualties of World War I for them. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's still, you know, that's when the body count starts going up, that's when you start really considering it as holy crap, we're at war.
Yeah.
But other than that, it seemed like a fairly well fought battle from all sides, because they, like you mentioned in the episode, they weren't conceding grounds to the enemies, they weren't getting pushed back, they were really fighting quite well considering they were outmanned and outgunned.
Yeah, it's a little funny when you think about it, because these colonial forces were brought, the ones who did face combat, because most of them, they were in labor roles and such, but they were thrown into some of the thick of it. They were thrown in the Macedonian front, you know, over in the Balkans, and then in multiple places in France, and some of the rough battles too. And their officers, who, I'm going to go ahead and say it, were old fashioned and were prone to racial attitudes, had a lot of good things to say about them. So that's an eye opener. And a lot of them got dispatches that showed their courage. You know, like when you get a medal, it gives you kind of like a title, you fought bravely, and etc. Mm-hmm. So it goes to show that, yeah, they were a significant fighting force. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean their trench warfare definitely seemed to they definitely seemed to hold their own in that respect. I mean, as far as questions go, it all seems pretty straightforward as to why they were fighting, because the compensations they received seemed to be a hell of a lot better than they would have made anywhere else. Not just for themselves, but promises to their families should they perish, where they would receive their, whatever you call it, their pensions. So
pensions,
that's, you know, you go back into those days in Southeast Asia, the economy wasn't quite booming yet. Although you are talking about a very heavy, like a trade heavy region. All the ports were opening up around there. Territory was kind of, I don't want to say free to take, but a lot of those port cities were kind of passing from hand to hand, back and forth in that whole period, as we've covered in a million other episodes. So, you know, there was a lot of opening for trades, but those countries, definitely weren't big on the map yet. So this was probably all in all their best way to make money and to provide for their family. So they seemed to be more than gung-ho to do it.
Yeah, and I actually don't go into it too much in the episode, because the episode really tries to focus on the war, which is kind of funny, because I guess if I could have redone the episode, you should probably focus on what happened to the countries themselves. So politically, you know, a lot of these guys, they actually signed up because they thought it would improve the chances of gaining independence for their country. They're politically motivated men. And they brought it home. Like as we know later, a lot of people, you know, they have the image of Southeast Asia. Oh, it's immediately after World War II, all these countries fight for independence. But the birth of that is much, much earlier. And World War I is a key point for a lot of these countries.
Right.
Not to mention, you know, it's as we've seen with actually other countries, kind of like when China came back from World War I, a lot of the men that were in Russia, they brought back ideology, a certain Marxist one. When the Vietnamese or even the Thai came back from World War I, they brought back their own ideology. They had learned a lot of different things, because, you know, some of them were students, some of them were just observing, and a lot of them noticed that these so-called superior people that had been bullying them back home, the Europeans, were not as strong as they thought, and they weren't all powerful. As I make a big note of in the episode, especially when they, I think it's the Vietnamese, if not the Cambodians, that took quite a note of how the Germans gave them a good thrashing, and were wondering, well, why are we fearing these people back home? You know, back home, these people are like basically slave masters, you know, controlling us in the fields. Yet when we come over here, we see them plowing their own fields. They're no different than us. It opened up a lot of eyes to, you know, the reality of the world, we'll call it.
Yeah, seeing the play field as a little bit more level, and
Mm,
I think that was a big part of it too, motivationally on a country level, not for individual soldiers, but
yeah.
talking about them signing on in hopes to kind of level out some of these unequal treaties, of which there were, again, many of that we've talked about in previous episodes, and
Oh yeah.
hoping that would kind of help them wipe the slate of those, because
Yep.
that was a big part of them, I guess, viewing themselves as inferior countries, maybe, or other countries viewing them as inferior.
It goes
Whereas if
both
they could
ways.
get, yeah, whereas if they could kind of wipe those off the board by signing on to help with France or whatever it may be, then they might secure themselves a bigger seat at the table, so to speak, or a seat at the table at all.
And then you have the interesting case where, yes, the case for Vietnam and the Cambodians is they're part of French Indochina, so they are a colonial country. But for Thailand, Thailand was an independent sovereign country, and they independently sent a force over. And the the Entente, I won't call them the Allies, they agreed to it and they allowed it to come over. Although, mind you, the Thai were a little bit late to the war and they didn't really get to do much, but they still marched in the parade. They had an air force, which is quite interesting, and they managed to thwart colonialism basically by showing a strong face, and it actually worked. They secured their borders because they had lost before World War One quite a bit of territory to the French and British.
Well, I think for Taiwan, that might have been part of the
Thailand.
thinking was made. Thailand, sorry. It's been a long day. I haven't had enough coffee yet, but I think that might have been part of the idea. Is they might have been able to pick apart some territory or take some back by pushing German forces back.
Yeah, and in the end, I mean, all these countries got more information, more skills, soldiers properly trained. All these guys came back home. A lot of them became people in politics, some actually future prime ministers, presidents of their countries. And some of them started the independence movements that would spring forward closer to World War II time. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword if you see it from the colonial side. The colonial masters got desperate, they asked for help, and then they started insurrection in their colonies, basically, especially the French.
Mm.
And I think at this point, I'll just bring up, I know it's going to come up later in the comments because I already have the questions offhand, but a lot of people would notice, and I even said it in the episode, that I had to basically choose 3 countries to talk about. When I labeled the episode Southeast Asia, I was actually thinking about calling it just French Indochina and taking out Thailand. But in the end, when my research was finished, I settled upon Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. Could have added others, but there just wasn't enough time, and I know there's probably a lot of people are disappointed, and I can tell in the comments. So I'll speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, there were some questions about the Philippines and stuff that I saw for sure.
I mean, there's more than the ones I'll name right now, but in my research, I did look into Burma, Laos, and Philippines. Burma well, I guess I'll start with Laos. Laos is an interesting one because Laos and Cambodia kind of fall into the same exact situation where they're these small countries, and Laos has this unfortunate thing with borders going on at the time where it's kind of too close to some border skirmishes. So what is Laos is actually technically part of Thailand too. So people that would consider themselves from Laos fought either for the Thai or for French Indochina during World War One. A few of them, not an extremely large number, but there was some, and they did the same thing as the Cambodians basically. And here, actually, I got some of my information to toss up. For Burma, I'm going to actually leave that a little bit later because Burma is going to come up for the Q&A, for answering the audience questions. But I'll talk about the Philippines. The Philippines was an interesting beast of its own for World War One. So in the United States, as I don't know if you know this, Justin, the United States basically made the Philippines a protectorate. It's not exactly a part of, I'll call it their empire, but it's a protectorate. So they're looking after them. And at the same time, World War One is about to kick off. The United States is openly flirting with the idea of giving them independence. So they passed a law called the Jones Law of 1916, which initiated what we'll call the process of gaining independence over a certain period of time for the Filipinos. So the Filipinos were ecstatic to hear this. I mean, they had fought quite a few wars at this point against the Americans and against the Spanish and stuff. So they were pretty hyped up. And when World War I kicked off, the Filipinos were extremely invigorated to sign up and fight for the Americans and alongside the Americans.
Makes sense.
Yeah, the United States, well, it only helps their situation, as you would imagine. The United States only entered World War I in 1917, a bit later, so it's kind of put everything, in a stall. But once the United States started the war, it basically allowed the Philippines to say, hey, can we please join in? And the United States agreed. They thought it was a good idea that the Filipinos participate as a country, because there had already been a lot of Filipinos in the United States who were Filipino-American at this point, who would fight for them. But for the Filipinos themselves, the United States had two major concerns. They were scared about arming the Filipinos on their own soil, because as you can imagine, it's a protectorate and the United States still has interests. So they don't want to arm some guys that are going to form an insurrection against them. Kind of obvious.
Right.
The other thing was they were a little bit scared about sending untrained Filipinos to the front in France, because they thought they'll get massacred like everybody else, which, yes, that would happen. The alternative would be to bring the Filipinos to the Mexican border, where the United States was having a huge, untalked about little war with the Mexicans. But they thought the Filipinos would go through so much prejudice by their own people that it would be a catastrophe, which it probably would have been at that time. So they didn't go for that. What the United States eventually signed off for is to allow the Filipinos to form their first National Guard. So it worked out. The Americans could take most of their forces out of the Philippines, dedicate them to World War I, and then secure the Philippines with Filipinos mostly. They allowed a 14,000 strong force to be built, and they were training them. They even gave them aircraft, and they had their first kind of Air Force, I guess you could call it. It was rudimentary because the United States had the worst aircraft ever for World War I, so it was probably a joke. But anyways, they started all this, and the Filipino National Guard, which I'll just call the PNG, it's easier to say, was formed. And they eventually were ready for service. And the day they were officially fully mobilized was November the 11th, 1918. The exact day the war ended.
So, I was just going to say, it sounds like they might be a little late to the party.
Later than the Thais. So the PNG, it stuck around for a while. It gets disbanded, I think, like 2 years later. But it was the starting point, for an army that would actually be produced in time for World War II. And during the Pacific War, the Filipinos would fight tenaciously against the Japanese, alongside a crazy American general called Douglas MacArthur, who screwed everything up. But it's not the Filipinos' fault. It's Douglas MacArthur, in my opinion, and that's in the future.
Right.
But other than the Filipino force itself, a lot of Filipino Americans did fight in World War I. And I have the name of the first Filipino American who died. His name was Private Thomas Claudio. And 600 Filipinos were estimated to have joined the U.S. Navy, 4,000 in the U.S. Army. And we have an estimate here that reports about 62 Filipinos most likely died in World War I, fighting for the Americans.
Okay.
So I could have definitely made an episode. And I could still. Maybe I'll look into it. Although I think there's even better events to talk about as far as the Philippines is concerned, rather than World War I. There's a lot more you can talk about, especially just before World War II. There's a lot of interesting stuff.
Well, I mean, the thing with the Philippines, when you compare them to Thailand or anything else, is that they don't have any landmass on the continent. So even if, let's say, World War I goes south, and Germany starts marching across, they're not the first ones that are going to be losing any ground.
No.
But was the Philippines like kind of a key naval stop or a seaway stop for either U.S. troops or anybody going to that area during World War I?
It's a key naval stop for the Americans.
Yeah. So, I mean, that in itself is a lot, which was probably one of the reasons why they had a protectorate on the country.
But the Americans are mostly stopping there actually to threaten the Japanese, not the Germans. So it doesn't really serve the Filipino people at this point much more than a headache in case the Japanese decide to do something.
So all that tension between Japan and USA and all that stuff started way, way before World War II, I guess.
Immediately after the Russo-Japanese War, it was Theodore Roosevelt himself that started all the plans to basically put I would argue, the wheels into motion to start a war. They planned everything out. They intensified the Philippines. They made it like kind of the base of operations, and really early on.
Right.
Well, actually,
I mean, that definitely makes sense. And like I said, that whole area, that whole region is just not talked about, especially in our Western history. So,
not at all. I didn't know any. I had no knowledge of most of the research I had to do for the Southeast Asia. The only thing I kind of knew was the Philippines a bit. Anything involving French Indochina, other than knowing they're colonies of France. I mean, I knew much more about African troops in World War I on both sides. The Africans that fought for the Central Powers and the Entente Powers, and I think there's about 4 million of them. So, in the greater scheme of things, a lot of people will talk more about that. And there was battlefields in Africa too, so it's kind of much more talked about when you think about colonial troops. And then what is colonial troops? Are we considering us Canadians, the Indians, Anzac and all that? I mean, we're all colonial forces, and we were sent to fight the wars of the Europeans after all.
Right. Now, I won't ask you for too much on this because it's probably a rant that'll lead us into a whole other video or a whole other series of this podcast. But did some of these countries kind of pick up their activity, and were they more active during World War II type of times, or?
Oh, yes. So if you're talking about French Indochina, which gets invaded immediately in World War II by the Japanese, it's completely taken over. And Thailand allies. Thailand is the only country to be an actual formal ally to the Empire of Japan. Who else are we talking about here? That takes care of all the guys in the episode. As far as the ones I didn't talk about in the episode, the Philippines, of course, is a huge part of the Pacific War. Burma is another huge part. It's where the British are fighting. And Laos is part of French Indochina at that point too. So yeah, it all kind of falls into line.
Yes, obviously, World War II, there's a lot more action in the immediate area. I guess some of them didn't have to go all the way to France to see the front lines type of thing.
No, they were just invaded and really oppressed. Really, it was rough being under the Japanese yoke for anyone and any country that got taken over. I mean, it was worse for the Chinese, but it was never really it wasn't a good time.
Right.
I think I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we had some questions in the comments that I was reading. I'm
going to try and do this rather quick because there's quite a few questions. So one of the first ones, and I answered some of these actually in the comment section, but I'm going to reiterate more because I actually want to talk about it on the podcast. I had one question here. I did not realize the foundational role World War I had in the independence movements in China and Southeast Asia. I had always thought it was World War II, but thinking on these movements all began before World War II. Was it similar with India and Burma? In Australia, we celebrate Anzac Day, I guess in Australian speaking, and it signifies when we decide to stop groveling to Britain and going it alone. As Canadians, we we have like the exact same situation.
Yeah, no comment.
India is, I guess, arguably the country that the most happened for them in their independence movement, because World War I was, just like World War II, a colossal loss of blood for India. They are the unsung heroes of both world wars, and it's really horrible what happened to them. So to talk just briefly about a little bit about India. At the time of World War I, and by the end of it, India's population grew, stronger from like the fighting, and they gained kind of a sense of nationalism as a result of everything they had done. And, they suffered heavily. Heavy taxes were raised upon them. This led to high inflation rates. The Spanish flu hit immediately after the war, killing a ton more people. They were hit
That was another nasty one.
Yeah. They were hit by massive trade disruption like the Southeast Asian countries because of World War I, all the shipping routes. And simply the high death rate caused by World War I, as the Indians were thrown in some of the worst places on earth at that time, this all led to a strong sense of nationalism and hatred for their colonial masters, Britain. To appease India, the British increasingly handed over more and more power, i.e. self-governance, because the British, they have to take their military assets out of their colonial countries to bring them to the front lines. But if you have all these people in high administrative positions, well, what do? You have to train locals to take these positions over. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing if you're looking at it from the British point of view, who want to hold the crown jewel that is India for their empire. So after the Indians saw Britain getting absolutely smashed by the Germans, they started to really understand their colonial master was not invincible, much like we were talking about with the Southeast Asians, and that they could be overcome. Britain no longer, held its authoritarian role in the world anymore. Like World War I really hurt the British Empire. And India, it's not like they thought they're going to get independence right away after World War I, but as time gets closer to World War II and you see the Gandhi movement and everything, India makes a firm line in the sand moment, where they're like, we're going to fight this war for you, but we're getting independence. And I'll get to that later in the future with Churchill and the horrible things that he does to India and stuff, but India will get its independence through much more suffering. We'll say that much. The guy asked about Burma, which I'm not too, Burma's one of my weaker points, but I'll try and put in my 2 cents. Burma's participation during World War I was limited, much like French Indochina. They had mainly provisional troops, although they did send engineering units to places like Palestine and Mesopotamia, where they fought bitterly against the Ottomans. That was some rough stuff. Thousands of the Burmese volunteered to serve as, anything from drivers, sapers, laborers, or they joined the 70th, well, that word hurt me there, 85th Burma Rifles, which was raised in 1917 and 1918, which, as I said, they fought the Ottomans in Palestine and places like Mesopotamia. The Burmese, as we know them, is actually a bunch of different ethnic groups. And oddly enough, the British chose to take a lot of the minority groups out of Burma to use as soldiers instead of going for the majority. Don't know why they chose to do this. Maybe it was something about keeping the population in line. Regardless, a lot of these groups were Chins, Kachins, Burmans, and Karens. And they fought mostly in places like Palestine, Mesopotamia. That's mostly what they did. And also, Burma itself housed a lot of POWs, so Turks and some Germans in places like Rangoon. And what else is to be said? I remember in my research finding out a really tragic report of an ethnic group called the Kachin, if I'm pronouncing that properly. I'm sorry if I'm not. And they come from kind of a unique area in Burma that has a unique climate. And they were stationed in Palestine, which you can imagine is a desert. And apparently the change of climate was so brutal for them that a large number of them committed suicide as a result. It's really a sad story.
Yike.
Yeah, and Burma went through the same things as all the other countries, a disruption of their economy because of the war. And there was a real problem with their import exports. So Burma actually sits upon quite a lot of different resources, like zinc, lead, some oil, wolfram, and rice. Like most Southeast Asian countries, they export rice to pay for a lot of things. But two-edged sword happened because of the disruptions with the trade initially. They decreased in exporting rice. Then the Germans put unrestricted submarine warfare, which almost completely stopped them from exporting rice. And this led to an enormous tumble in the prices. Unemployment went up, poverty went up, caused decades of economic decline, and they had been on the upswing. Burma was a lot of money was pushed into the country. Britain was actually trying to establish something there. It really hurt them, and the people suffered tremendously. So as you can imagine, these people are suffering and they're looking for blame, and of course they're going to blame the British for getting them into this mess, and it is the British who did. And Burmese independence movements would flourish. And in World War II, there was the independent Free Burmese Army that fought against the British for the Japanese, and a lot of that started here with World War I.
Wow.
Same as India, actually. India had its independence movement, had the Free India Army. Same deal. They fought for the Japanese, and it wasn't insignificant amount of people, but yeah, it did some damage, and it's should have opened the eyes of the colonists. Things are wrong. Another question. Some pretty good points you made, and you crucially pointed out how the First and later Second World War broke the perception of European origin people among many populations, weird way of saying it, shattering the myth that they were destined to rule over others. This is something quite a few popular retelling of both world wars miss. They turned what were once powerful nations into neutered versions of themselves, and showed that Europeans in general were in no way special compared to the rest of the world. I would be interested to hear more about post-Tokugawa Japan. In particular, I would enjoy a very detailed take on various aspects of Meiji era, as well as the history of industrialization in efforts of Japan in general. So I actually answered this guy. I just realized reading this comment. I answered him in the comment section. I told him, as Justin knows, I made an episode of the Meiji Restoration on the Boshin War and the Satsuma Rebellion. So it kind of answers a lot of his questions. But if he's looking for more,
specialty is Japanese history, so
yeah. If he's looking for more information on the industrialization aspect of Japan, some future content will come out soon where I'll talk about Taisho Japan. So that's the period right after, well, it's kind of at the end half of World War I for a few years, where there's a new emperor for a very short amount of time. And Japan goes through an economic crisis called like the Taisho economic crisis. And it's a short period of time, but it's significant. It's kind of like a real interchange between two completely different eras of Japan. So we had the Meiji era, then there's the short Taisho, and then we have the Showa era. The Showa era is what we see in World War II. And I think when I talk about the Taisho period, I'll make a lot of remarks about how it's different from Meiji and the industrialization. So you'll probably get a lot of your answers in that episode whenever I make it, because I'm slow at working on my own content now that I'm working for Kings and Generals on the side. All right, I'm going to go through this question real quick because I think we're running out of time. I was looking forward to seeing Burma mentioned, but I guess there was not much time. Yeah. Far as I know, the Burma rifles and sabers were sent to Mesopotamia and Palestine during World War I. So I kind of answered this question before. A few companies of Burmese rifles did end up fighting in the Middle East, and they did their fair share against the Ottoman Empire, and it was pretty bloody stuff. Not fun at all. And I mean, yeah, if I could go back, I would have had to change it. Maybe take away the section on Cambodia for Burmese, but I chose what I chose. I had to, and maybe I'll make future content on it. If not, Burma will be covered when I do everything on World War II, of course. All right, I think this is my last question. Wow, why the heck did Europeans bring war to Southeast Asia? That is why colonialism is awfully ridiculous. Yeah, I think as Canadians we can agree, because I mean, people I don't know if people in Southeast Asia think about it, but a lot of us in the Commonwealth, despite whatever skin color we might have, were thrown into this war because of our British overlords. Canada didn't have much of a choice. Anzac did not have a choice. India certainly didn't have a choice, and yeah, we all suffered tremendously for it. And I guess just to kind of explain, maybe if he's wondering why someone like Britain or France was horrible enough to bring all these people from all around the world to join in one of the worst things that ever happened to our world. The Entente powers were fighting a war of attrition against the Central powers, and they knew they would win in a long war. The Central powers didn't have enough people. The longer the war went, the more people would come from the colonies and eventually overwhelm the Central powers. By the numbers, by the end of the war, it's something like 22 million fight for the Central powers versus a 40 to 42 million for the Entente. And a ton of those are colonial powers. Here, I actually pulled up some numbers just to look at it. If we look at it from, let's look at Britain. Oh, these are only numbers from 1914. I know that Britain in the end sent almost 8 to 9 million people. But only looking at what they sent in 1914, yeah, it's intense. So people recruited from England alone added up to about 4 million. Scotland, almost 600,000. Wales, about 300,000. Ireland, 130,000. Canada, about 400,000. Australia, Tasmania, 330,000. New Zealand, 100,000. South Africa, 75,000. Let's look for something. This is all for the British. Indian Army, 1.5 million. There you go. Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. For France, let's look. Initially, at the beginning, there was 90,000 indigenous troops from French Indochina. Then between 1914 to 1918, it's like almost 500,000 colonial troops. So that's about 150,000 West Africans, 45,000 Madagascans, 50,000 Indochinese, 150,000 Algerians. It's a lot of Africans. Almost 50,000 Tunisians, Moroccans. We're talking, it's a lot of Africans that end up having to fight for France. It's a crazy amount.
Yeah, but I mean, when you think about it too, okay, people would ask, why would Europe drag all these colonies and everybody else into this war? But what was their alternative? Their alternative was to sit home. But if the Central Powers win and then start storming all over Europe and into East Asia or Southeast Asia or Africa, you know, the Central Powers weren't necessarily known for their levels of racial tolerance either.
You know,
so be a colony or be a captive. I mean,
not to go too far into the alternate history route, but Central Powers, let's say they win. This time period, let's say it was like an early war, you throw a few colonies to the other side, you know, it's like chips on a chessboard. So yeah, maybe French Indochina goes to Germany. What would it change in the greater scheme of things? Germany was trading with French Indochina. Everyone was. Different ships, a few different flags and a few houses. Maybe the administration's a bit different. Germany was never really that good at colonizing. They, not like the French or the British. Maybe it would have been better for French Indochina if the Germans took it.
You think?
The French were notoriously, and I think anybody who's watching these Vietnamese, the French were not very nice in Vietnam, and they'll pay heavily for it in the Vietnamese War. But the Germans, they were late to the whole game when it came to colonizing. Like for Africa, for example, the Germans they didn't do, okay, it's weird to say, they didn't do as mean things to the populations as the rest, like the French or the British. And yeah, maybe it would have been better for them. Regardless,
I mean, we're getting into theoreticals at this point, but
World War II, France gets taken over by Germany, and then these colonies are kind of just left in a muck. They don't know what to do, and they get invaded by the Japanese, and they're just looking for anything, you know, they want to live their normal lives, and they're getting disrupted by all these foreigners, and it just sucks.
Exactly. Go down that road. Is it better to help the Allied powers, or is it better to be attacked by Japan in that era? You know, we've talked many times about some of the stuff Japan did, and that wasn't very nice either.
No, Japan, yet again, I think I even said in the episode, if you need to look at who was one of the greatest victors of World War I, it's the United States and Japan. Japan, because they put very limited effort into the whole thing, but they got a hell of a lot out of it. Real easy poker hand. The United States basically just sucked up all the money, as they would in World War II again.
Yep.
And the British didn't get a mortal wound, but a pretty big wound in World War I, and then World War II would kill them. Their empire would crumble, and basically they would lose a lot. And France completely fell apart in World War II. Immediately.
Yeah, but then again, they did have the two of the more or less the biggest hats in the ring. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They had the biggest commitments, which means they stood to lose the most.
Yeah. Immediately after World War II, France finds itself at war in Southeast Asia. They make the situation so much worse. And when the situation is completely unbearable, they literally toss the flaming bag of shit to the United States. And then the United States starts the Vietnam War as we know it.
Yeah, there you go. Hot potato. Bye.
Yeah. So yeah, the French were, not to knock on them too much, but they have a tendency to do this in other places in Africa. And it gets us involved in all sorts of stuff too. Rwanda was another issue, not necessarily just the French, but they had a part in that. And I guess that pretty much ends it for this podcast. I hope everyone is somewhat happy. I didn't get to touch all sorts of different countries in Southeast Asia, but I can only do so much in a 19-minute episode, and I was really stretching it. I was supposed to get it down to 15, and I kept a lot in. So it was longer than it had to be.
Well, as always, too, if anybody has any extra questions, comments, something you'd like to learn more about, hit us up. You know, we always like discussing things, researching things.
Yeah.
You know,
And, yeah, like
if it's big enough, we can even do a separate episode on it, kind of like this was. So.
And like Justin said, if you want, I can make a community poll and ask what was worse, my Vietnamese, my Thai, or my French.
Oh, we'll put them all together. We can put the Asian pronunciation and the French pronunciation, and I'm pretty sure French still loses.
And if you want a bonus round, I just finished recording for the Pacific War podcast for Kings and Generals, where I had a very, very heavy Dutch episode where I had to pronounce a lot of places in Dutch, and I bet that one's going to be even better.
Okay. We'll talk about that after the episode because I need that recording for personal reasons. Mostly my enjoyment.
Yeah, it's going to be special. I chose to have a full quote, 2 sentences long that's in Dutch, so that'll be memorable. I don't know why I did it to myself either.
Dear, it's like Christmas come early. I can't wait to see this.
And there's a lot of Dutch who watch Kings and Generals, so they're gonna go after me. Google Translate for the win.
Well, can't wait to see it, but hope you guys enjoyed this discussion, and we'll catch you next time.
Over and out.